Now, our next speaker, who you can see scrabbling around in the undergrowth here, Dr. Colin Beale, I had the pleasure of meeting at the PAOC meeting in Senegal, where he was the chairman of the scientific committee. And I have to say that his phenomenal energy and leadership not only ensured that the PAOC was against some expectations of success, but I would go so far as to say that without it, the meeting might not even have happened. So that was an amazing contribution there. Colin took his first degree at Imperial College in London and his PhD in ecology at Glasgow University. I don't have a date for that, but I think you can see he looks fairly young, so you could probably say it's after 1985. And after several posts within the UK and with Rocha in Lebanon and Portugal, he is now lecturer in ecology at York University. He and his team have broad interest in all aspects of spatial ecology and conservation biology, both in the UK and abroad. And in Africa, his team are studying the fundamental drivers of the savanna biome and undertaking applied research to reduce illegal activities in protected areas, issues which have already been raised today. Now, he again has gone the extra mile to be with us. I can tell you that he only arrived back from Tanzania this morning, so we've couriered him in from Heathrow to stand before you and give his talk on ornithology in Africa, current status and future prospects. Colin.
Thank you very much, Richard. This is a slightly ambitious title, and it follows from a talk where at the Pan-African Ornithological Congress, where I attempted to sum up 5 days worth of talks in 15 minutes. And Richard asked me to give some sort of overview of the science of ornithology across Africa. So I decided, instead of just sticking with the PAOC brief, to try and read everything that has ever been published about African ornithology and summarize it for you in slightly longer. So I'm going to take you on a virtual safari through the science of ornithology in Africa. And I'm going to give you some gratuitous bird pictures along the way, some of which I've taken from my time mostly in Tanzania. So I'm going to start right at the beginning, the early days of ornithology, go back to the Victorians, and here's Professor Major J.M. Hildebrandt, who was a German explorer in the 1870s, 1880s, and has lent his name to several birds that hang out in East Africa. And in those days, the early days of ornithology, it was very much about describing new species and being carried around while you did so. You had the easy life, if you were sick, at least. And this is the story of descriptions of new species. This was very much what happened since the 1750s. Scientific descriptions of species have increased. Pointer here, let's see if we can make this work. This is the number of species described across the whole of the world, and you'll notice the scale is slightly skewed, so somewhere around about 10,000 species today. Started descriptions scientifically back in the 1770s, and the glory days of describing things in the world and in Africa were in these 1800s. That's the actual numbers of species described per year, according to the sort of taxonomic authority that's added to each name. So if you wanted to describe new species, you needed to live 100 and something years ago, which is a little bit of a shame. And the same was true for Africa. We do still see new descriptions of species. And just last year, there were 3 new species of forest robins described. They were actually picked up from museum specimens, but they're genuinely good species. You can see that they look rather different. And if people had been listening to them and looking at them, it didn't take the molecular methods that we have today to identify these as new species. So there are more species to be found in Africa. But the bulk of our work as ornithologists these days has moved on from simply describing what is there and where it is. And one of the most interesting bits of science across the whole of ornithology recently is a re-description of the taxonomy and the rearrangements of the families of birds across the world. I think we finally sort of settled on something that actually describes the way things are. It's going to change a little bit in the future, but I think we're there. And some of these new taxonomies, new arrangements of families, are quite interesting in terms of what's going on within African birds. So one of the main changes, I think, I've just zoomed in on one little bit, is this new clade within the water birds. So it turns out that water birds evolved more or less once, and virtually everything from seabirds to storks to divers and grebes form one clade within the whole mass of birds. And within that, there's this little group here of weird, mostly African things. So we've got Scopus, that's the hammercop, Balaniceps, the shoebill, and these things are sisters to pelicans. We always thought they were storks, but the new methods that we have looking at molecular level details tells us very clearly that these things are not storks at all. They're short-billed pelicans. Essentially. So we're learning new things about the way these species have evolved, and Africa is full of oddities. So that's quite exciting work. That's sort of still very descriptive about what's going on. But if you want to zoom into the last 25 years, let's say, and ask, well, what is the ornithology that's being done at the moment in this area? I managed to get hold of around about 1.5 million scientific papers. That's the total number of papers that are freely available online since 1990. And I searched through those, not manually, but with a computer, to look for every single scientific name of a bird that is an African species, and that appeared along with Africa. And this is what surprised me about the results. This is just a word cloud of the words that are in those papers. So I searched through 1.5 million papers to find all the ones that had an African bird name and Africa anywhere within the text. And that came up with about 27,000 papers. And these are the words. And it really surprised me. I expected to see something about birds in there. But it turns out that the vast majority of papers about African birds are about malaria. And avian malaria and other forms of disease and health, and the impacts of wild birds, such as the ducks in particular, and their associations with people, and how that's leading to disease, the transmission of disease across Africa. So that really surprised me as an ornithologist, that the vast majority of scientific papers about African birds are talking about health. So I thought I needed to narrow down the scope of the study somewhat. And just search for the sort of key ecological journals. These are the journals that I might be publishing in and things. And now we're sort of starting to see some of the things I did expect. So species is there, but health is still very much a big part of the picture, even within those key ecological journals. But there are words like conservation, migratory populations, and breeding populations, and various bits and pieces coming out. And there was something in the order of 17,000 papers in those ecological journals since 1990 that are broadly defined birds. And some of those population studies are things like the African penguins, lots of seabird studies in particular. So I thought what I needed to focus in on slightly more narrowly, because 17,000 papers is still quite a lot, I need to look at just the ornithology journals. So zooming in to the ornithology journals and still searching just for the papers that describe African bird species names over time and done in Africa, I decided to sort of split it up into different topics. Ecology covers a whole range of sub-genres from demography, where we're looking for information about breeding success or mortality rates, anything like that. Things about conservation of these birds, anything to do with climate. I thought these topics might be quite interesting, a whole list of different stuff. And this is the number of papers since 1990 in the key ornithology journals, international ornithology journals. And the first thing that struck me was that there was a lot less work out there than I expected. So the peak in any one year was only 120. This is the black line, shows the total number of all papers published in ornithology journals about African birds, international ornithology journals about African birds in each year. And you can see some really weird changes. Something went wrong in the late 1990s. I don't know what happened. It's very odd. And then since about that peak in 2000, it looks as though there's a little bit of a gradual decline over time in the numbers of papers that are being published about African birds. And that's set against a background of massive increase in the total numbers of papers published in these journals. So there's a very large increase in the ornithological literature over time, but there seems to be a decline in the ornithology, the African ornithology component of that literature within that larger picture. So to pick up these trends slightly more generally, I then say, well, what about the proportion of studies that are doing each of these? So you can see it looks as though each of these things more or less tracks the overall picture. You can see behavior and physiology seem to come out incredibly badly in the ornithology journals. They're both stuck underneath each other at consistently 0. So people are publishing their behavior papers not in ornithology journals, which was one thing to begin with. But broadly speaking, there's much the same sort of pattern. So to pick up trends, what I said was, well, what proportion of papers are doing each of these different things over time? And that's what you see here. So obviously the proportion of papers, every paper would be 1. And you can see that a number of these things, these top ones, the demography, conservation, climate, and distribution, those first sets of colours are all increasing. So this sort of surprised me. This is my colleagues getting more strategic about how they sell their science. So they're trying to cover more key topics in the descriptions of their papers than they used to before. So in the 1990s, we might write a paper about climate impacts on birds. Now we're trying to use the buzzwords for a whole range of these different things. So there's a general increase. And now most papers would attempt to align themselves with a lot more subgenres of ecology. It might be that ecology is getting slightly more multidisciplinary, or ornithology is, or it might be that we're just getting better at using those buzzwords to sell our papers. There are some genuine trends in here, I think. So we've got some things going on. Migration, studies about migration, that was words including migrants, timing of migration, phenology, that sort of thing, are increasing. And I'm just going to pick up on a couple of these trends. And what I was a little disappointed to see is that ecology is right down here at the bottom. So broader ecology studies of how birds fit into the environment, the roles they play within the environment, and the processes that shape the habitats and ecosystems that these birds live in is still very much a minority within ecology. So I'm going to pick on a couple of these. This is one of the most interesting areas, I think, that's been developing very rapidly in the last few years, and it's looking at migrant studies. This has obviously been driven by large-scale declines in Palearctic migrants to Europe, and the European Conservation Organization is saying, well, what's going on? We've got to go and see what they're doing in Africa. And I think that's behind that bigger increase in migrant studies than before. And one of the things we've been asking that I think is quite interesting is saying, well, how do populations that breed in one place spread out as they get to Africa? Do they all shift together so that if you're neighboring nests, you end up as neighbors in your winter territories? Or do they spread out across the whole of the winter range? So we've got here a number of different hypotheses, a number of different suggestions of what might be happening. And to understand each of these figures, you imagine this little upper circle is the breeding range. That's the distribution, say, of a pied flycatcher, all the way from northern Spain right into the Ural Mountains in the east, and even further east. And one particular population, if you go and mark all your birds at one point, then they go down to their non-breeding range, which for this species is most of the sort of tropical forests and subtropical forests of West Africa. They could have a very high spread. They could go all the way from the west to the far east, individuals from the same thing. So that's what we would say would be a high population spread. Or they could all go, and they could be neighbours relatively close to where they are compared to the whole range. That's a low population spread. This is another alternative. There could also be some mixing going on. So if you look at two breeding populations, these ones have high spread, so they're quite spread out, just like these ones from this breeding population. And they're also intermixed with individuals from this population here. And so you could have both high population spread and high mixing going on. Or you could have broad scale shifts that this breeding population are narrowly distributed, low population spread, and very little mixing in the winter. They keep with their own and their neighbours. And you can have all different combinations of these things. So you can have low population spread with high mixing if the winter range is smaller than the breeding range. That's quite a common thing. And you can obviously have high population spread and low mixing. So these were the theories that people came up with and asked, what would these different things mean for conservation of our Palearctic migrants in Europe if any of these different things is happening? You can imagine that if this is happening, if we lose this portion of the winter range, so if that's where there's massive habitat loss, then this breeding population is stuffed. It's gone. Whereas if this sort of thing is happening, if you lose this portion of the breeding range, same portion, you're actually going to see a depression in the populations across the whole of the breeding distribution, but you won't see sort of holes forming in it as particular populations going on. So it's quite interesting to ask these questions. And that is a little picture of the movements of individually marked birds with geolocators or radio tags from across European breeding populations to their winter distributions. And the broad summary seems to be that there's incredibly high mixing and incredibly broad population spread across every species, not every species, most species that we've looked at have mix a lot more in the winter than they do in the summer. So this does mean that we're going to see population declines. We can't pin it down to what's going on in one little corner of Africa. It's a continental scale issue. That seems to be one of the themes that's coming out from these studies. And the other thing that I'm quite interested in is what I'm calling serial residency. So wintering populations don't always just go down and sit in the same place. We've seen this beautifully with some of the radio-collared or the GPS-collared birds, where they'll go and spend a month in one corner of Africa, and then they move on reliably to another month, and they're resident for a month or so, and then they keep moving on again. But they stay within a small home range for a month or so, and then they move on. So serial residency seems to be a pattern for a large number of our Palearctic migrants. So that's all very interesting stuff. But there's also some beginnings of some really interesting information on intra-African migrant movements that's just starting to get up. So this is some preliminary data on two woodland kingfishers that were breeding down at this site in southern Africa. And the pink one's the female and the blue one's the male. And they both went to winter, well, one in CAR and one in South Sudan. Who knows what they were doing when they were up there. But we're beginning to get some information on individual movements of intra-African migrants. And I think that's going to be really exciting to compare the strategies that they have in Africa and African systems to our European ones. The other bit that I said was slightly disappointing to me is that ecological studies are rather lacking. So these are where we're talking about the big processes that shape the environment. And one that is very close to my heart and that I study quite a lot in Tanzania is fire. So fire is an essential component of the savanna biome. For a lot of Europeans, fire is wrong. It seems inherently bad and it shouldn't be part of an ecosystem. In Africa, in the savannas in particular, it's absolutely essential to maintain the savanna. And I've been working with a bunch of people to try and understand the impacts of different fire regimes, different way of managing it on the biodiversity that happens. And we've come up with an interesting concept that is helping shed some light on how fire works, which we're calling pyrodiversity. So not all fires are the same. You can have hot fires, if you can have cool fires. You can have really big fires that cover hundreds of kilometers. You can have tiny little patch fires. You can have fires early in the season, late in the season, and all of those sorts of things. And in any one place, you might get a very steady fire regime that always has hot fires at the end of the rainy season, or you could have a wide variety of different fire types within one cell. Using satellite imagery, we can track individual fires across Africa. And we've developed this index that we're calling pyrodiversity, and it shows enormous patterns. So from very high pyrodiversity in the largely drier areas of the edges of savannas, this is just the savanna biome we're picking up, to patches with really low pyrodiversity. And we were interested in what's going on. Oh, and you can also see we have a lot of fun burning things. It's possibly the most fun you can have in a savanna. It's torching it. I burn World Heritage sites. So, and this is a sort of take-home message, I think. Each one of these dots is part of a protected area in Africa, and the bird species richness as recorded from those cells. We've put them on the rainfall gradient because rainfall is a crucial component of diversity. Within the savannas, you can see it has a broadly humped distribution, so you get highest distribution, highest species richness at intermediate ranges. We add this line at 650 millimeters because this is functionally quite an important distinction for savanna types. And you can see the colors of the dots relate to that map I showed you before, the pyrodiversity of those individual sites. And in low pyrodiversity sites, particularly in wet savannas, you get very low or relatively low bird richness, whereas it's almost 50% higher in sites where wet sites with high pyrodiversity. More than 50% of species are added to the community when you do that. And a lot of those species are specialist savanna species that are very restricted ranges within those wet areas. So we're quite interested in that process in general. I think that this is something that ecologists and ornithologists need to be thinking in more detail about. So within that mass of the ornithology literature, the other questions we can ask about what are we actually studying? What species? There's about 2,500 species in Africa, depending on how you count them. And this is the number of papers I found for every one of those species. And you can see about 50% of them have 0. So we're only studying half of the papers. And most of the ones that we have studied have only got 1 paper. There's a few really highly studied species with lots and lots of papers. One of them is the Seychelles warbler, we've already seen. Other ones are some of the widespread or Palearctic migrants that we see. So barn swallows up in the top there with pied flycatchers, both in their winter ranges there. And perhaps species is a little bit too narrow. So I then broadened it out and put them in their families and said, okay, how many studies do we have by family? There's about 125-ish families in Africa, going from ostrich on this end to buntings on this end. That's the sort of taxonomic order. Some of the big ones you see are the hawks and the eagles. That's up there. It doesn't surprise me. We know that a lot of people like these things, and that includes the vultures. We've got gulls and terns, waders, and ducks and geese in particular. The wetland species are very well studied. They're the big spikes in these things. But obviously some of these families have more species than others. So you can also express this as sort of papers per species, which is what we've got here. And this, at the high end, picks up some slightly surprising things. So generally families with relatively low diversity, but fairly well studied. So that's not so interesting. But what's interesting then to me is what's down at the bottom. Where are these gaps? What are we not studying? And what should we be studying at the family level? The well-studied things, the vultures. I won't actually go into the story of this because Hazel did such a good job. I liked his video earlier. That was great. Of talking what was going on. But obviously there's a lot of studies in those in the well-studied groups. And that's the actual annual rates of decline in the 4 regions that we divided Africa up in the paper we had a couple of years ago. But these are the missing birds. Some of them are particularly African. I've just picked up some of the ones that I was surprised no one is working on at all. Woodpeckers, very underrepresented. There's a lot of diversity They're really important as ecological engineers. They create holes for a whole diversity of species to live in. We don't know anything about African woodpeckers. Button quails, again, the hammercock, it's species in its own family, African, no one's studying these things. And the African barbets are very underrepresented with cookie strikes as well. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, in terms of looking at some of these interesting groups. And I thought, well, maybe we're just focusing on the endangered species. So I've divided up the red list status and said, well, papers per species in there. On the right here, you've got your least concern. And sure enough, they're slightly less frequently studied. But actually, there's not much difference between these species at about 1.5 and these at about 1.3 papers per species. So we're not really strategically focusing our studies on just the red list ones. There's a lot going on. And I think that's reasonable, but it's interesting to say that. And then this sort of expands slightly on what Hazel was saying before. This is the study areas described within the 13,000 papers about birds in Africa. Notice the scale. I've had to skew massively to show anything because South Africa with 162 is way off the top. Everywhere else is down in these 50-ish papers down to 1 and some places with 0 as well. So there's some enormous geographical bias. There's quite a lot of, there is a bit going on in lots of places, but there's very, very heavy geographical bias. So we said, well, who's studying them, just as Hazel did as well. And this is the same sort of word cloud of the affiliations of the authors of those 13,000 papers. And you can see there's the USA's coming up there. South Africa does still just have the majority. English resources, scientists are doing a lot of them. Some of them are familiar. So you can see Rondebosch, that's the Fitzpatrick Institute coming up. I'm surprised not to find any evidence of Aplory's work in this international literature. It's not jumping out at me there. But there's quite a heavy dependence, at least in the international literature, on overseas ornithologists, with South Africa as the main exception to that. If you look at the individuals who are studying them, you see some of the same thing. There's a lot of South African names there. There's a lot of very white, rather old males there, but not all of them. There's some others. And there's a real shortage of Africans from outside of South Africa. In the big letters, there's only one I can find, and she's female, so that's encouraging. So there is something going on there. There are some people that surprised me that I didn't realize were working in Africa, so that was quite interesting as well. But my summary overall really is that for some reason we're seeing fewer papers every year about African ornithology in the international literature. They're covering a wider variety of topics within them, or at least they're claiming to. And there are some major gaps in the species and families that we're studying. There's also some major geographic bias with relatively little indigenous African science behind this. And it may be that some of this is just because it's really hard to do ornithology in Africa. My personal experience of that was being locked up by these guys for 4 days in Tanzania for being a British spy. When I was trying to find the range distribution, the limits for rufous-tailed weavers in Tanzania. You can get in all sorts of trouble. There's diseases, there's army operations in Rwanda that are illegal and unknown of. And it makes it quite hard. And it's sort of, that summary sounds a little bit bad to me. It sounds as though there's something going wrong. And that is set against this background that the Pan-African Ornithological Congress back in October was a really successful event, at least I think it was. And there were people talking about birds in every one of the dark green countries on this map, which is almost as wide as that ever published in the last, since 1990. So there's a lot of work going on out there but it's not getting published. It's not getting published in the international literature. And I think that that is a concern. As a scientist, I think that the peer-reviewed literature is the gold standard for what is science. If you're doing studies but not publishing it, it may as well not have happened. It's not enough to say, well, we did some work. Science only becomes science when it's being published in the peer-reviewed literature. And there are problems with not doing that. There's problems that individuals have the knowledge of the work that they've done, but then they move on somewhere, and it's not shared. It's not properly shared, so it can just disappear. But it also is the threshold of quality. It's the quality assurance that we need if we're going to persuade governments that these things are real and that these are important. And I know from my interactions with government officials in Tanzania that when I can say, look, here's a paper, it's published, then they start to take notice. If you just say, well, we think that this is going on, we've done lots of work on this, they're very happy to ignore you. But if it's there on their desk, they're much more likely to engage with what we're talking about. So what can we do? I don't have as many answers, but I think that some of it has to do with more detailed mentoring. I think that part of the reason we're not seeing this happen is that there's too much expectation on a lot of the young ornithologists that are coming up in Africa to do everything. They've got to do the conservation work. They've got to do the research. They've got to be the person liaising with the government. They've got to be the publicity machine. These individuals have to be so widespread that the thing that falls off the pile is to publish the paper that actually supports what they're proposing. And I think that with some further training, we can build that up. And I think that there is also a place for continued rewards and recognition for those people who are getting the papers published at the end of the day. I think that helping individuals working within institutions that I work with in Tanzania, if they're recognized internationally, said, look, these publications that you've done are brilliant, that actually carries a lot of weight with their employers and helps them to develop their careers and establish themselves. So international recognition for the work that they're doing, getting things published, is really a potential way we can help do some of that. But I'm keen to hear other ideas as well. And so I'm just going to wrap up by giving thanks to various funders who paid for some of my work in Tanzania and elsewhere, and also two people who, if the photos weren't acknowledged, they were mine or they were Ron's and Dowdy's. And to thank you all for listening.
Superb talk, Colin. Thank you very much indeed. And we do have some time for questions before tea, so I'll
go back to your first word cloud.
The very first one. That one.
To me, that suggests a need and an opportunity, because if most of those things where birds are appearing are in those type of publications, it's almost a need for BirdLife International Africa to have conversations with decision makers outside of authority in those countries. Because if that's the main focus of birds, the outside world is seeing, all the other stuff that we're doing is talking to ourselves.
Yeah, a lot of this was bird flu as well. So, and there's lots of things going on. Which,
in general, if that's how most of the outside world is seeing birds, there's a conversation to be had. To change that focus.
For sure. And to engage with it as well.
Yeah.
Colin, can I ask, when you were talking about the challenges that African ornithologists haven't been published, would you say that those are to do with linguistic challenges, like in English, for example, or are they more to do with the quality of research and so on that they're doing?
I think what I spend most of my time doing when I'm mentoring African scientists is teaching them how to spin things for the international world. So a lot of the time we fund very specific conservation projects that are focused on research. I want to know about how these things breed, the basics of those sorts of things, which are very descriptive. And it's about framing that study within an international perspective, to say why is this of wider interest than that one thing, and that's what gets things published in the peer-reviewed literature. Otherwise, it's a simple description and testing hypotheses. I think that there's a weakness. So that the distinction for me between essentially natural history and ecology is moving from descriptions to testing hypotheses. And a lot of the scientists that I'm working with in Tanzania are unwilling to challenge the status quo by testing a hypothesis. And sometimes their training is somewhat different, and it's very much about saying, well, what's the description? What's going on here? Rather than saying, is this right? Was this expert over there who said this thing a few years ago, was he actually right? And I think that that's part of the mentoring process that we need to help develop. And then they'll be able to reach out to this international literature and get through the peer review process much better. They're working incredibly hard in the field. Long hours, early mornings, intense heat, horrible diseases, and it's not being recognized because the way they're presenting it is being let down. So it's spinning that.
Colin, is there any evidence of editorial bias in the sense that decent work may be being submitted, but editors have a particular view about what they want in their journals, which doesn't fit what's being sent to them?
I'm not sure, to be honest. There are definitely biases in the peer review process against names that sound female. Yeah, and there are biases against names that sound Asian. I don't know whether anyone's looked at the African things. So the double-blind peer review, it's relatively small, but it exists, and we should recognize that as scientists. Yeah.
Yes.
Based on what you said, then, it's a real shame to hear that. Is there a role of partnering?
So that's very much what I think needs to happen more. So there's also, it's a two-way thing in that we've got to be very careful as people like me, white, foreign, come in and say, well, I'm going to teach you how to do this. And we've also got to have people willing to ask questions and admit that they need assistance. And that for some officials who have got their job, they've got their position, essentially, is admitting that they need extra help one way or another. And that's quite difficult for some Tanzanians in particular. Yeah. I suspect so. Yeah. But I see that changing among the younger generations in Tanzania, and that's why I'm having such fun out there at the moment. Yeah.
Well, Colin, thank you very much again. Absolutely superb talk.